Hello, class. I hope that you are all in good health and good spirits as much as can be during this time, this quarantine time, and that your family, your parents, your grandparents are all in good health, and that you are receiving support. That you all have quiet places you can do your homework and think and study and read and complete this semester with success. I am here to help you. Please email me at any time with any questions you might have, and I respond pretty quickly. This lecture is on the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. Although the date I have up here is 1835, that's when the conflict really starts with the Texas Revolution, the precursor. The foundation for the Mexican-American War is the Texas Revolution. So the greater conflict is 1835 to 1848. The major war between the United States of America and Mexico occurs between 1846, when hostilities begin, and 1848, when at last the United States of America, the US, conquers about half of Mexican territory, including modern-day California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, a large part of Nevada, some parts of southern Wyoming, and Colorado, which were all at once Mexico in 1848 become parts of the US. We have this famous quote on our first slide: "Pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos." Said to have been spoken by Porfirio Diaz. And it means, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. And often quoted to describe the relationship between the powerful United States to its southern neighbor, Mexico. So there are two major stages to the Mexican-American conflict. Before we get started, the war with Mexico is a very important milestone in American history, and it really is overshadowed by the great event of the 19th century. And there are many threads throughout the 19th century. There's slavery, conflict with the Native Americans, Native genocide, the westward movement, the Louisiana Purchase. Many major events occur in the 19th century. The major conflict and event of the 19th century, we know, is the American Civil War, where roughly 620,000 young men lose their lives. Some historians say the number they think now is more around 800,000 young Americans lose their lives, mostly young Americans, lose their lives in a conflict that begins in 1861, when Americans go to war with fellow Americans. And more Americans lose their lives in that war, fighting other Americans, than any other war in the United States history. So that is a defining moment in American history, the Civil War. And the Mexican-American War really is overshadowed by that great event taking place 20 years after the Mexican-American War. But the Mexican-American War is also a defining moment in American history. The Mexican-American War is the first war of conquest. The United States, this fledgling nation, it's the first war of conquest it undertakes against another sovereign nation, Mexico, that it was at peace with, and goes to war for the sole purpose of territorial acquisition, since no conflict existed before the war between the two nations. So any way you look at it, it was a war of conquest. So there are two major stages to the 19th century conflict with Mexico. One, the Texas Revolution from 1835 to 1836. And as I said already, the greater conflict, the defining conflict, the Mexican-American War between Mexico and the US, April 25th, 1846 to February 2nd, 1848, when these two nations go to war against each other. Question: what was the Texas Revolution? And how did the Texas Revolution affect America and American history? First, the first question: what was the Texas Revolution? The Texas Revolution was an armed rebellion of Texian. Texian is a name given to Anglo-American immigrants and settlers in Texas, at that time called Texas. It was a Mexican state. And Tejanos, Mexican nationals, so two major groups: Texians, which were Anglo-American settlers, immigrants in Texas, and Tejanos, Mexican nationals living within Texas. And those two groups formed a rebellion. They were unified. It's a nuanced conflict. This is a war of independence that joins Mexican nationals with Anglo-Saxon immigrants together against the Mexican government. It's not black and white where there's a clearly defined line between Anglo-Saxon immigrants and Mexicans. This is not the case, because there were Mexican nationals also fighting alongside white immigrants against Mexico in order to gain independence as an independent republic away from Mexico. Ideas of progress, technology, an idea of forward-thinking ideas influenced these settlers, Anglo-Saxon settlers, as well as Mexican nationals. There are Mexicans living in what are today Texas and California at that time, who saw the United States, who believed the United States was progressive and the nation of the future. And they wanted part of it. They looked back at Mexico City and Mexico and saw infighting and revolt after revolt, and a nation steeped in tradition, ruled by the Catholic Church. And they looked to the north and saw a nation of progress. Of course, it's more nuanced than this, but these are the two ideas. This is really how both nations are characterized at this time. From many viewpoints on both sides of the border. So let's finish this definition. The Texas Revolution was an armed rebellion of Texian and Tejanos living in the Mexican state of Coahuila y Texas, both united against the armed forces of the Mexican government, resulting in the formation, that's a typo, of the Republic of Texas and the eventual annexation of Texas as a 28th state of the U.S. Union on December 29, 1845. The revolution, the creation of the independent Republic of Texas, and the annexation into the U.S. all set the stage for a larger conflict to follow, the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1845. Another question, how did the Texas Revolution affect America and American history? The Texas Revolution set the stage for the larger conflict of the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. From one perspective, what occurred in Texas was indeed a revolution. Yet from another perspective, especially looking, if you're in Mexico City and you're a Mexican leader and you're looking north to what has happened in Texas, in Tejas, from your point of view, it may be different. Yet from another perspective, it was an invasion, an usurpation of power of Anglo-American immigrants against the sovereign nation of Mexico. As we step back from the particulars and varied perspectives, in reality, it was both at the same time. Because, as I say over and over again, we know that history is nuanced. History is not as easily defined by drawing lines in the sand and saying this is a defined group and this is a defined group and they all think the same way. They're monolithic entities of thought and culture and ideas, right? And this conflict, this event in history is evidence that history is complicated. As we step back from the particulars and varied perspectives, in reality, it was both of this at the same time. No matter the perspective, from the Alamo, Washington, D.C., or Mexico City, one thing is clear, at least to me. The Texas Revolution was a harbinger of woes for Mexico and the beginning of the American Empire. Question: what was the Mexican-American War? Answer: the Mexican-American War was a military conflict between the U.S. and Mexico. The Texas Revolution and annexation of Texas as a state in the American Union, into the American Union, angered Mexico. So Texas, Tejas was a Mexican state, just as now California, Texas, Oregon, New York are American states, right? States within the American Union. After the revolt, Texas gains independence and is annexed into the United States. At no point during this time does the Mexican government recognize Texas independence. They still see it as illegal. An illegal attack on a sovereign nation that was at peace with the United States. This angers Mexico. It angers Mexico against the Anglo immigrants it had initially invited in as settlers, right? Immigration has always been a major topic throughout history, whether we're talking about German immigration into ancient Rome. In one way, the invasions are actually German immigration. Whether we're speaking of the Irish in the 19th century or the Mexicans in the 20th century, nations with clearly defined borders have issues with immigrants and immigration throughout history. And this was the case as America pushes westward and encounters the borders of Mexico. Mexico invites Anglo-American settlers to come into Tejas to populate the state. But there are conditions. This is before the Texas Revolution. A few of the conditions that Mexico sets for Anglo settlers coming from the United States into Mexico, this is something we don't often think about, right? With our issues of immigration in the 20th century, where Mexicans are seeking to come to the United States as immigrants. At one point in time, as America is pushing westward, Anglo-Americans are immigrants into Mexico. So Mexico invites Anglo-Americans into Tejas to populate the state, to become productive citizens. Mexico gives them land, but there are conditions. And the conditions include that they must become Catholic, that they must swear allegiance to Mexico and become good Mexican citizens. I think many Anglo-Americans who come into Texas, they know the rules are there, but there's conflict, there's cultural conflict. Perhaps many do convert to Catholicism. Perhaps they do only publicly to gain land. But many don't, because this is the time of the Second Great Awakening. Christianity is a big deal still in the United States of America, as it was in the English colonies. If America is not a Christian nation, in many ways, it's a nation of Christians. And the predominant religion is Christianity. And it's many varied forms now in the mid-19th century. We have the old Presbyterian Church, Anglican Church, but new, enterprising, enthusiastic evangelical churches like the Baptist, the Methodist, Mormonism. As America goes westward, so does Protestant Christianity. And although these are frontiersmen coming into Texas, no doubt many of them would have identified as Christians, as their parents were, as their grandparents were, and going back to Europe. So there's cultural conflicts. These are two different peoples coming who are rubbing shoulders, so to speak, in Texas. On the one hand, Mexican Catholics. On the other, Anglo-Saxon American Protestants. And both peoples are intensely patriotic. In fact, you'll be hard pressed to find two more patriotic peoples in the world besides the Mexicans and the Americans. Go anywhere in America and you'll find American flags everywhere, won't you? The same thing in Mexico. Go to Mexico, you'll find Mexican flags in cafes, restaurants, along city streets, on farms, on ranches, the same way you do in the United States of America. And this was the case, I believe, in the mid-19th century. Two fiercely patriotic nations, steeped in their own cultures, fiercely cultural, and devoted to their religions, devoted to the Virgin of Guadalupe and the Catholic Church in Mexico, and devoted to the various forms of Protestantism in the United States. Let's finish this definition. The Texas Revolution and annexation of Texas as a state into the American Union angered Mexico, who viewed the annexation as an illegal land grab by a greedy, ever-expanding United States. Americans believed in manifest destiny, and Mexico was a roadblock to taking their civilization from coast to coast. Apart from the Texas Revolution, no major antagonisms characterized the relationship between the two nations. Westward expansion alone was the major cause for the war. At the conclusion of the war, in 1848, Mexico and the United States signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico lost nearly half its territory, including what is today California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Right? With the signing of the treaty and the previous annexation of Texas, the United States once again nearly doubled its size. Manifest destiny fulfilled. From coast to coast, the United States now touched both coasts, the Atlantic and the Pacific, after the war with Mexico, 1848. Question: how did the Mexican-American War affect America and American history? The Mexican-American War was the first war of conquest against another sovereign nation for the sole purpose of expansion. No enmity existed between the two nations, who were at peace with each other. Those who were against the war, and there were many politicians and American thinkers who were against the war. Those who were against the war made this point: that America gained its freedom by fighting against an imperialist power, the British Empire. 80 years before, right? 40, about 60 years before, 60 or so years before, they'd fought the British Empire. Since the American Revolution, Americans believed their fledgling nation was cast in a different mold than imperialist Europe. In one sense, for good or evil, the Mexican-American War changed America's identity into an imperialist power in some ways. This was certainly an imperialist war, fought against a sovereign nation for the sole purpose of expansion. Here's a map, the United States in 1830, right? Several years before the conflict with Mexico. We have the South, the North, Florida Territory added, Arkansas Territory, 1828, unorganized territory in the gray, and Oregon country in the blue. And this whole area of yellow is Mexico in 1830. As America pushes westward, as I say over and over again, America encounters various peoples. What to do about the French? Well, Jefferson was able to buy that territory from Napoleon and gained the whole Louisiana territory by buying the territory. As the United States comes upon Mexico, the United States approaches Mexico and attempts to buy Mexican land the same way it had purchased the Louisiana territory from Napoleon. Mexico refuses and says, our land is not for sale. This is our nation, and we're not selling it. What to do about Mexico? Mexico is a problem. Mexico stands in the way of realizing the destiny that has been manifested to Americans to take American civilization from the Atlantic to the Pacific. What to do about Mexico? If Mexico is not going to sell, what to do? This was a quandary. This was a problem to be solved. Well, many Americans, not all, but many Americans believe that the United States should not go to war with Mexico. That this is a sovereign nation. This is America's neighbor. And to go to war with a sovereign nation for the sole purpose of conquest, for the acquisition of land, would betray American ideals, American anti-imperialist ideals. And of course, many more Americans believe that Mexico is not doing anything with it. They're a bunch of lazy Catholics. Californios are just having fiestas and parties and showing off their riding skills on their horses and dressing up in Spanish outfits, and the women are beautiful but just dance the days away, and they're lazily enjoying their siestas and not doing anything with the land. This was the idea for those who wanted to overtake Mexico. Here's a westward expansion map showing the original states and those that were added not long after the Revolutionary War. Mississippi Territory, Northwest Territory additions, Florida ceded by Spain in 1819, Texas annexed in 1848, annexation again that Mexico did not respect, and they believed it was an illegal annexation. And those areas to the far left in, I think, light olive green, I could be off, California, Utah area, Nevada, New Mexico, conquered by the United States. Another map showing a whole map of Mexico, 1845 to 1846. The southern part in pink is what Mexico is today, pretty much. This reddish purplish color, disputed between Mexico and the United States. Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico, and Alta California, Northern California. Of course, all this area, Alta California, Nuevo Mexico, the disputed part of Texas, would all become part of the United States in 1848, after the war. Here's some dates. Of course, I won't have you memorize most of these. I think I have a couple of highlighted in red in your study guide, but gives you an idea of the progress of the war. And here's a map. I love war maps. They can reveal a lot. And it shows you where the major battles are taking place in what is now the United States, in California, in northern Mexico, in Mexico City. Winfred Scott lands in Veracruz and marches into Mexico City. And there's mythology surrounding the Mexican defense in Mexico City. Over here in California, we have battles in Los Angeles, in San Diego, in the Bear Flag Revolt, in Sonoma, 1846. I want to read this original source document out. It was a letter written home, a letter of an American soldier in Mexico fighting against the Mexicans during this war. And he writes a letter home to his dad. And it's dated November 26, 1846. It's a very fascinating letter. It says, "Dear Father, what could have possessed you to send me way off here in Mexico? Your notions of military glory are altogether too exalted. Yet it was natural for you that had fought in the Revolutionary and late wars to entertain a big opinion of battle. As for me, I detest it. It's all well enough to talk about it, but a most dreadful thing to practice. While our town was alive with the victories of Palo Alto and Resca de la Palma, while my blood was hot, while everybody went a-soldiering," well, he's talking about the initial romantic rah, patriotism before the war, when young men are signing up in their small towns across America to go fight the Mexicans. Right? Everything's romantic. They're kissing their sweethearts goodbye. This is before modern imagery, modern photographs and TV that really reveal the horrors of war. The way Vietnam was broadcast into living rooms in the 60s and revealed to moms with their boys in Vietnam how horrible war was. So this is what this young man is saying, right? It was very romantic when we were leaving our hometown, but now I see a different view of war. I thought it would be rare sport to march to Mexico. Visions of sunny skies and tropical fruits, of rare and lustrous-eyed beauties, and of reveling in the halls of Montezuma, danced before my mind. But 'twas distance lent enchantment to the view. The gilded and dazzling aspects of glory have changed like the pretty scene of a theater, when one passes from the far-off boxes to the nearby side wings. If you will not be offended, I will whisper in your ear my private opinion of war in general, and of this Mexican war in particular. Well then, it's a stupendous humbug." That might be like it's a bunch of bullshit, you know. But for the stirring music and fine dresses, it would pass for just the same as other butchery. There is no fun in cutting throats. I've tried it. The other day, I dissected several of my fellow creatures in the most approved military style. But do you think it was pleasant to see their bowels gush out and to hear their cries of agony? I shudder to think of it, though it was a whole month ago. Even my platoon, a set of rough-looking fellows as ever you saw, looked then as if they had been physicked. I am obliged to Mother for her advice, but it's worse than thrown away on me now. It's no use to read the Bible in the midst of swords and bayonets. Somehow or other, I feel all the time that what I am reading and what I am doing are very different things. Either I am or that book is wrong, the Bible. How can I pray for those that I mean to kill the next minute? How rejoice in goodwill among men when all my deeds are designed to stir up bitter strife and enmity? If the Mexicans are made of the same blood with myself, what right do I have to spill it? Can I love my enemies and keep shooting at them all the while? Besides, if I were to do to the Mexicans as I would have them do to me, I should let them alone. No doubt, many of them have a kind father, such as you, and a mother like mine, and sisters and brothers, or better than all, wife and children. And I should hate to be popped forever out of the sight of such. With what face can I kill a Mexican? No, no. If you want me to be a good soldier, don't request me to read my Bible. The spirit there and the spirit here are not at one. Next week we are to have a brush. I shall do my best to run my sword into half a dozen Mexicans. Poor fellows. I shall really hate to do it, for they so enjoy the war. I don't mean that they love fighting, not they, but they do love the American army. It is a reasonable attachment, for we protected them from their own military leaders and from the Indians, and purchased their products at the highest prices. The Mexicans indeed are the only persons, as I see, likely to reap any advantage from this invasion. Our forces are a perfect godsend to their little towns. The gates are at once thrown open, and the citizens get frantic with the excitement of brisk trade. Blowing out the brains of such jubilating, good-hearted simpletons is no joke. But I am called out. Farewell. It's pretty powerful. Letter home to his father, where he's conflicted, right? He's conflicted about his mom suggesting he sit down and read the Gospels, but what I read in the Gospels is not what I'm seeing here, right? It's the teaching of Jesus to love your enemies, to love your neighbor as yourself, to all of the things that Jesus says, right? He sees conflict with that. I should have read this, right? Here are some images coming from Mexico at this time. I love using photographs. We're at a time period now we can use photographs. So the top are Mexican citizens during this time of conflict with Mexico. The bottom left is a U.S. soldier, and the two bottom rights are a Mexican cadet in front. A Mexican mom with her two daughters, a young Mexican man. Bottom left, a young American soldier and a young Mexican cadet who would become a soldier, and his friend. Here are some flyers that Americans, young men would have seen posted in their hometowns when the war started against the United States and Mexico. To arms, to arms! 100 men for the United States Army. To the patriotic citizens of Holmes County who are willing to fight for their country, and particularly to the members of the Holmes County Volunteer Company who pledged themselves to be in readiness to march when the company would be accepted. President Polk runs a presidential campaign on the idea of westward expansion. A great deal of his platform concerns westward expansion and the annexation of Texas as America's pushing westward, right? President Polk believes in spreading America across the continent all the way to the Pacific. A few months after becoming president, June 6th, Texas becomes a 28th state, just months after Polk assumes the presidency. When he becomes president, there's debate in Washington what to do with Mexico. March 1846, General Taylor leads troops past the Nueces River toward the Rio Grande River, and there shots are fired in territory that is not owned by the U.S. But the U.S. enters land that Mexico believes is their own. And the report given to Polk is that the Mexican army fired upon the U.S. Army on American soil. And it was a lie. This is the news that is spread across the United States, that Mexico and Mexican soldiers fired upon U.S. soldiers on American soil. And this is the pretext for war and stirs the patriotism in the hearts of Americans everywhere. And young men go to sign up to defend America against the Mexicans, when in fact the Mexicans never fired on Americans on American soil. So these young men have read in the newspapers that it was a Mexican army, Mexican soldiers who fired upon American soldiers on American soil. And that was not the case, even though this is the news that is spreading. And young Americans believe that they're signing up for war to defend American honor against Mexican transgression, Mexican aggression, against the sovereignty of America and Americans. Here's a quick original source document, a quick quote from a U.S. soldier writing from Camp Belknap in Texas, 1846. Our food is abominable. When you break a biscuit, you can see it move, if the critters are not dead from eating bad flour. The pork and bacon are of the same character. We would not mind this so much if they would only serve us out enough. If not for the wild beef we shoot, we would starve. And there are many Americans who are against the war. These are a handful of the more famous Americans who are against the war. A young Abraham Lincoln, Congressman Abraham Lincoln, was against the war. Massachusetts Congressman John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams, is against the war. Author Henry David Thoreau is jailed when he refuses to pay taxes to support the war effort. While in jail, he wrote his famous treatise, Civil Disobedience. And of course, anti-slavery forces are against the war. They want to stop the spread of slavery and believe that any new states could very well be slave states. And this is the vision. This is the vision of the southern states. Southern slave states have a vision for America that's quite different than the vision for America than most in the North have. And this will come to a head 20 years later in 1861. That rift that is happening in America, that divide, we can see the cracks here. Well, the cracks existed at the very formation of the republic, and they're growing. That crack that existed between Federalists and Anti-Federalists on the mercantile North and the rural South, those small divisions that began in the early republic and now are becoming a chasm at this time, and will become an uncrossable gulf by the time we reach the Civil War in 1861. So anti-slavery forces. John Quincy Adams, here's a quote referring to the Mexican-American War. He said it was a most unrighteous war. Ulysses S. Grant, one of America's greatest generals who led Northern Union forces against the South in the American Civil War, was a young soldier in the Mexican-American War, as most of the Civil War leaders, generals who fought in the American Civil War were during the Mexican-American War. They were young soldiers. Most were West Point graduates who fought together in the Mexican-American War, but fought against each other in the American Civil War. But Ulysses S. Grant told a journalist this in 1879. "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico." And this is one of America's greatest generals. "I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage to resign." Here's a longer original source document that Ulysses S. Grant gave. "With a soldier, the flag is paramount. I know the struggle with my conscience during the Mexican War. I have never altogether forgiven myself for going into that. I had very strong opinions on the subject. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. I had taken an oath to serve 8 years, unless sooner discharged, and I consider my supreme duty was to my flag. I had a horror of the Mexican War, and I have always believed it was on our part most unjust. The wickedness was not in the way our soldiers conducted it, but in the conduct of our government in declaring war. The troops behaved well in Mexico, and the government acted handsomely about the peace. We had no claim on Mexico. Texas had no claim beyond the Nueces River, and yet we pushed on to the Rio Grande and crossed it. And yet we pushed, and I am always ashamed of my country when I think of that invasion." And this is a man who fought the Civil War. And even after the Civil War, he's still thinking about the war with Mexico. Here's a small excerpt from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the treaty that was signed between the United States and Mexico at the conclusion of hostilities in 1848. "There shall be a firm and universal peace between the United States of America and the Mexican Republic, and between their respective countries, territories, cities, towns, and people, without exception of places or persons." The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. Here's a map of the United States after America acquires the lands taken from Mexico: California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, parts of Wyoming and Colorado, and pretty much conforms to the border as we know it today, as America stretches from New York to San Francisco, Brownsville to Seattle. In less than 100 years, the US goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Well, that's it for this lecture class. I will be uploading more videos after our spring break. Happy studying.